What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going over the Stamina Necromancer DPS. So Necromancers actually saw a bit of a change. I don't really want to call it a change, but they saw a nerf going into Greymoor. Your siphoning ability, whether that's Detonating Siphon or Mystic Siphon for Magicka Necromancer DPS, that is now back on the global cooldown. So in Hero Storm, it was off of the global cooldown, which basically meant you were able to use Siphon alongside another ability at the same time. This basically saved you one global cooldown per rotation, allowing you to get a little bit more spambles, more Blighted Blastbones, etc. Out there. Now that they put Siphon on the global cooldown, we now need to basically give up that global cooldown for Siphon, which means we have fewer spambles, fewer Blastbones, and therefore we actually see a DPS loss with this change to Siphon now being on the global cooldown. Both Stamina Necromancers and Magic Necromancers have seen a DPS drop because of this change. Now, they're still powerful DPS, Stamina Necromancers in particular, and they are still the only source of major vulnerability in the game, which is a very important debuff in group content. So you're still going to see 3 Magic Necromancers or Stamina Necromancers in any sort of given organized raid group, but your DPS is going to end up seeing a bit of a drop just because Siphon is now back on the global cooldown. So like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any sort of gear in this video. That is reserved for the DPS gear video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what sort of gear you can be running as a Stamina DPS, make sure to check out that video. This video is going to be focusing in more on the skills and the rotation. So first, let's go ahead and get started here with our front bar skills. This is a dual wield bow build, so we have dual wield on the front bar. We have Venom Skull, Blighted Blastbones, Unnerving Boneyard. Now you can use the other morph of Unnerving Boneyard, which is Avid Boneyard. This gives you your own synergy that you can activate, which allows you to have better uptime on Lokkestiiz if you want to go that route. Unnerving Boneyard provides AoE Major Breach and Major Fracture though, which could be more beneficial to group DPS, particularly in trash fights, where you're able to apply that to basically everything that you hit within that Unnerving Boneyard radius. So it's up to you which one you want to use. Now, you do want at least one Necromancer in Unnerving Boneyard, so that might be you, that might be somebody else. Just keep that in mind if you're going into an organized raid group. Then we have Detonating Siphon, Barbed Trap, and Flawless Dawnbreaker. On our back bar, we have Skeletal Archer, Poison Injection, Endless Hail. We have Detonating Siphon again for the 3% additional damage done bonus while we have it slotted. Barbed Trap again for the 3% additional weapon damage, and we have Pestilent Colossus. Now, one thing that you can do is you can actually keep Detonating Siphon here on the back bar, and then swap Detonating Siphon out on the front bar for something like not Steel Tornado, the other one, Whirling Blades instead. And now the downside of doing this basically means you only have 3 Gravelord abilities on your front bar here, which means we only have 30% additional crit bonus here in Execute. Now, if we take a look at our current crit chance, we have 45.9% crit chance with our potion. That bumps it up, so that's Major Savagery, that bumps it up to 55.9, and then with Minor Savagery, that bumps us up to 61.9. So if we decide to go this route here, we'll actually be less than 100% crit chance in Execute, unless we swap out Flawless Dawnbreaker for Pestilent Colossus, like so. So this could be something that you might want to do if you want to use Whirling Blades and Execute. It's kind of up to you how you want to do that. Now, do keep in mind that Whirling Blades is going to be fairly expensive, and it is going to be a little bit more difficult to sustain Execute if you decide to go with this particular bar setup. So it's kind of up to you. This bar setup will give you higher DPS, but again, it is a little bit harder to sustain here. So it's up to you how you want to go about doing that. So I actually will be doing that bar setup here just so you guys can get an idea of the amount of sustain difference there is. I do have a previous bar saved up with the previous bar setup that I just showed you guys to be able to take a look at that. Now here you do have a flex spot here on the back bar for Barbed Trap, so you can use any other ability that you want to have down here. So for example, if you want to self-heal, you could run something like Echoing Vigor, just to give yourself a little bit of healing in sort of self-sustain. You could also run something like the medium armor line evasion, either the Mars for major evasion if you'd like, for some more survivability. So you do have a couple options here with a flex spot on the back bar here. Um, Now I do also want to talk really quickly with CPs. Now, Necromancers do have an additional passive under the Gravelord line known as Dismember. So while you have a Gravelord ability active, you get an additional 1500 spell and physical pen. So that basically counts all of these 5 abilities here. Typically speaking, you will have at least one of these abilities up at any given point. So Necromancers already have inbuilt into their toolkit an additional 1500 physical penetration. This basically means one of two things can happen. You can, instead of running Sharpened here, it depends on whether you have Tremor Scale or not in the group, you can run something like Precise instead and just keep your typical blue CPs. If you have Tremor Scale in group, then you wouldn't be running Sharpened anyways, so you would just have Precise anyways. But the big thing is going to be your CPs. So you're going to have to change your CPs around to kind of fit that additional 1500 penetration. So for example, here I have 36 penetration piercing rather than the typical 60 to 61 instead. So you want to sit anywhere between 34 to 36 if you're not running Tremor Scale. If you do have Tremor Scale, then you're going to be dropping piercing down even further to, I believe it is 10 or so. Yeah, anywhere between 9 to 12 piercing is what you would hit if you have Tremor Scale in group. And that's just because Tremor Scale does provide additional, roughly speaking, 2400 additional penetration. So dropping down to 9 to 12 would give you a little bit of leeway just to kind of account for possible downtimes on your resistance debuffs like Pressure, Alkosh, and so on. But if you do have Tremor Scale in group, then you drop piercing down even further. Just remember to try to hit that 18,200 penetration total. That pretty much covers everything about our skills. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation. So because you're going to be within melee range, it's actually a fairly simple rotation. In a theoretical sense, at least. It's very similar to Wardens, if you guys are very familiar with Stamina Warden DPS rotations. It basically goes Shulks, 2 abilities, Shulks, 2 abilities. You kind of have the same thing here, where it's going to be Blastbone, 2 abilities, Blastbone, 2 abilities here. Now, the one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind here is with Detonating Siphon, make sure that it runs completely out, because it does need to last the full duration to get the additional disease damage explosion there. So just make sure that Detonating Siphon is not recast too early, because otherwise you will lose out on that additional disease damage explosion at the end. Skeletal Archer can be recast a little bit early if you decide to do so. Just don't try to recast it too early, because very similar to Venomous Claws on a stam decay, it deals more damage the longer it is out. So you don't want to recast Skeletal Archer too early, because then you start losing out on the harder hits. So just be mindful of that. Ideally, you want Skeletal Archer to run completely out, but at the same time, you also don't want to lose your Gravelord passive here. So you might want to recast it just a little bit early with like 1 second left or something like that, so that way you're still getting as much out of it as you can, but you're not necessarily losing out on additional penetration. Hopefully you will have Boneyard up when that happens, but it might not necessarily fit the case, so don't be afraid to recast Skeletal Archer a little bit early if you need to. Other than that, your rotation pretty easy for the most part. Depending on whether you want to or not, you can always pre-summon your Skeletal Archer. Then you start off with Rearming Trap. Start with your back bar rotation. You can see here it's basically Blastbone, 2 abilities here. So you will need to more or less have to kind of do a lot of bar swapping here if you're going with this, because your Detonating Siphon is on your back bar rather than your front bar. But the general rotation should be fairly straightforward, as you can see. It's just Blastbones, then 2 abilities. But it does require a lot of bar swapping, because you do have 4 abilities you need to activate on your back bar here. And you might also need to time your Blastbones, because Unnerving Boneyard will consume a corpse if there is a corpse out. So depending on how you time it, you might end up having no corpse out for Siphon, because Siphon also requires a corpse. So you might need to play around with timing a little bit. But that's the general rotation. And once you hit about 25% or so, you swap over to, instead of running skulls, you run rolling blades instead. That's going to be roughly around 25% or so. Make sure to use your Pestilent Colossus when it is up and when your raid lead tells you to, because you don't want to use Pestilent Colossus when the boss is immune to major vulnerability. So just make sure to pay attention to when your raid lead calls it out. Hopefully your raid lead will have some sort of timer or add-on that will tell them when major vulnerability is able to be applied once again. So we're going to do a 21 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the kind of DPS that a Stamina Necromancer is able to pull. Now I do want to point out here that you should not use the trial dummy as an indication of what you'd be able to pull in an actual raid environment. The trial dummy is missing a few buffs like Minor Courage, Zen's, and Martial Knowledge, which would increase your overall DPS in a raid. Plus, it's a dummy, so it's not really hitting back at you. You're not playing any sort of mechanics, so in those fights, because you're playing mechanics, your DPS might drop a little bit. You're also missing out on a couple of sustain options, like the Master's Restoration Staff effect, so your sustain might also be better in raids too. So if you feel like your sustain is going to be a little bit low in a trial dummy, it might be okay in an organized raid group because you do have things like, Sentinel Gums, Blades, etc. We are running Lava Foot here, which is pretty typical for Stamina Necromancers. If you're an Orc, because you do have additional health line, you would just shift some points into health. So that is actually fairly typical for Stamina Necromancers. It's actually fairly hard to sustain Stamina Necromancer rotations without running Lava Foot, or at the very least sustain food. So that's actually not too unrealistic here. But if you do feel like your sustain is going to be a bit of an issue, just remember in an actual raid group you will have things like Siphon Blades, Sentinel Gums, etc. that should help out your overall sustain. The point of the trial dummy is not necessarily to mimic raid parses, but rather to provide some sort of level playing ground for all other classes to kind of compare between different Stamina Necromancers or just between different classes, because the trial dummy does standardize pretty much most buffs in the game. So let's go ahead and get started with this parse. Something that I like to do is I always like to do Blastbones into my Endless Hail. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I just find it easier for my rotation to always be like, okay, I'm going to do Blastbones with Endless Hail. And then Endless Hail ties into Poison Injection as well for me. Create another corpse here because my Boneyard did end up eating that one up. So this particular bar setup, your rotation is going to be a little bit more complicated than the first one, just because we do need to bar swap to cast Detonating Siphon. And I'm not quite as familiar with this bar setup as I am with that first one that I showed you guys. So my DPS here might actually end up being about even with the first bar setup that I showed you guys earlier. We'll find out. Oops. I activated a synergy on my back bar. Shouldn't do that because Lokkestiiz is only active on my front bar. Hopefully that doesn't make too big of a difference on our overall DPS. We're getting close to execute, so I typically start using Whirling Blades at around 25% or so. So around here is when I'm going to start using Whirling Blades rather than Skulls. Other than that, we pretty much keep everything up. Can drop Graveyard if you'd like in the end for more Whirling Blades. Actually not a terrible idea, but again, we'll end up losing some sustain as a result. Yeah, so that one wasn't quite as good, probably because I'm not quite as familiar with this bar setup as I am with the other one. So this one pulled about just shy of 81k, but the first bar setup that I showed you guys here, this is the one with Detonating Siphon on both front and back bar, and Barbed Trap here with Flawless Dawnbreaker on the front bar. This is the one I'm more familiar with. This is one pulled just shy of 84k, so 83.8k here. This is about what you would expect to see, at the very least from somebody with my Necromancer experience. I'm not the best Necromancer DPS. It's probably my least familiar DPS here, the Necromancer DPS, but still pretty good, but you'll definitely see that it is a DPS drop. And that's just because we do have to use that global cooldown for Detonating Siphon now, which, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, eats into our global cooldowns, makes it so we have fewer Venom Skulls, we have fewer Blastbones that are going out, so that does cut into our DPS by a fair amount here. So that change definitely served as a nerf towards stamina, towards just Necromancer DPS in general. Whether that was intended or not 100% certain. It looked like it was just used more as a fix for Siphon than anything else, and the DPS drop was an unintended consequence of that change here. But that pretty much covers it for this build video. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them all to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.